This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance by Nick Estes, a book I discussed here on The Dig with Nick Estes. Our History is the Future is at once a work of history, a personal story, and a manifesto. Now available in paperback, the new edition features an afterword by Nick Estes about the rising indigenous campaigns to protect our environment from extractive industries. As Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz puts it, this book is a jewel, history and analysis that reads like the best poetry, certain to be a classic work as well as a study guide for continued and accelerated resistance. Find Our History is the Future at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting this introduction from the road in Vienna. Once upon a time, neoliberalism created a framework for great power peace between the incumbent American hegemon and a rising China. But the 2008 economic crisis proved that framework to have been a brittle one. Relations soon began to sour as economic and also military tensions heightened. Under Trump, the conflict roared into an outright trade war, and then, under Biden, became systematically entwined with a new nationalist economic policy. 4 years, but with special precision under Bidenomics, this became a new Cold War waged in the name of reviving the American working class, even as its benefits have mostly accrued to major corporations, and as the Republican Party has continued to realign working class voters to the right. The new Cold War is a conflict that's simultaneously geoeconomic and military geopolitical, and it's already dragging the U.S. and China toward nationalist reaction and narrowing the space for a critical democratic politics. It's amplifying militarism across the Pacific, as well as within both countries' polities. This aggressive posture is a losing situation for working classes in both countries and also for the working class everywhere. It's nearly impossible to imagine a world in which we meaningfully confront the climate crisis or create the conditions for generalized global prosperity absent U.S.-China cooperation, or at the very least, the absence of great power antagonism. This is particularly true for the rampantly underdeveloped global South, whose brutal pillaging has always been the precondition for Western wealth. We must pursue a new way forward. It is a critical task for the left to develop and then hegemonize a clear alternative to the new Cold War with China, and thus a clear alternative to the present world system as a whole. The last year has brought internationalism and anti-colonial solidarity back to the forefront of activist concern. But how do these solidaristic commitments, how do they extend beyond national liberation struggles and connect to these new arenas of interstate rivalry? How does that connect to building a new international order? And how does it all integrate into our domestic agenda for egalitarian class power? My guest today is Jake Werner, who outlines what an alternative to the new Cold War might look like, after explaining how we got here in the first place. But before we get started, this is a podcast that's dedicated to providing the global left with the sort of analysis it needs to understand the world in our efforts to radically change it. That's why we put every episode out for free with no paywall, even though we would make a lot more money if we paywalled. That's because we're first and foremost a political education project. We are not a money-making scheme. We only need enough money to pay everyone who works on the show. And the reason this model works is because many of you who can afford to contribute do so at patreon.com/thedig. We also send our newsletters by email to all supporters, and depending on how much you give and where you live, we send books, coffee mugs, tote bags as a thank you. Please contribute now. If you're one of those listeners who keeps saying, oh, maybe I'll contribute later, but always forgets to do so, just do it. Punch pause and contribute. That's patreon.com/thedig. There is a link in the show notes. Click it. Okay, here's Jake Werner, acting director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute and a co-founder of Justice is Global. He writes on the connection between great power conflict and global capitalism. I'll post a link to his most recent report, A Program for Progressive China Policy, in the show notes. Jake Werner, welcome back to The Dig.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be back.
We've covered the historical background to the New Cold War with China on The Dig before, with you and Toby Chow, and also with Ho Fung Hung. I want to start this interview by recapping the most recent history first. A dramatic deterioration of U.S.-China relations under Trump over trade, intensifying with COVID, all with a military power in the Pacific dimension. And importantly, this new Cold War dynamic that solidifies under Trump then remains in place under Biden. The new Cold War, in other words, becomes permanent and bipartisan. And in a minute, I do want to get into the 2008 economic crisis and how that sort of triggered the deterioration of the relationship initially. But first, lay this most recent history out. How did we move into a new Cold War under Trump? And then why did Biden continue that policy? We live in a time of supposedly intense partisan polarization. How do we get this remarkable bipartisan normalization of anti-China politics?
Yeah, great question. And particularly because that polarization tends to make whatever Trump's position is kind of poisonous on the Democratic side. And we do not see that in China. So it is a really important question. It's a little painful for me as a historian to jump into the middle of it and be like, let's start with Trump. But you promised we'll get back to the history. So I think the key point for Trump is that already the foundation of the relationship had been deteriorating for some time. And he kind of came in and just accelerated all of these trends because of his own particular hobby horses around trade and economic nationalism. And that kind of galvanized what was already building up within the foreign policy elite into a sort of a broad embrace on the part of the foreign policy establishment of an anti-China politics. And then I think the other really important dynamic here is that mainstream Democratic Party elite was wrestling with its loss to Trump in 2016 and trying to figure out how to come back, how to win the next election, and then how to permanently overcome the danger of Trump and Trump-type politics. And their evaluation was that economic nationalism and anti-China policy and industrial policy, all of these things are kind of linked together as the core response to the challenge of Trump and the kind of rot in the underlying neoliberal system that it had revealed. So when Biden comes back into power, then we have a very different policy landscape in the Democratic Party. And sometimes that gets treated in isolation from foreign policy, and it's kind of portrayed as just progressives have more power. And some of the mainstream policymakers have come around to the progressive arguments about the bankruptcy of the free market ideology. But I think that if you do it in that way, you miss something that is really core to the whole politics, which is it's not just a domestic policy, it's also a foreign policy. And all of these things are kind of linked together in the thinking of the policymakers who are pursuing the Biden bid for hegemony.
As promised, I want to jump back a decade and a half and then really a few decades before that. In 2008, Americans experienced our financial system melting down. And that crisis, of course, took off at the centers of global capitalism, but it was immediately global in scope. And it was that economic crisis, you write, that also destabilized and ultimately forever altered a long-standing neoliberal framework for great power peace between the US and China. It was a peace, it turned out, that was incredibly fragile. How did this neoliberal framework for great power peace come together in the way that it did? And then how did it fall apart in the wake of the crash? How did the way that the new neoliberal global economic order, the way that it stitched the US and China together, underwrite such a world historic great power peace until ultimately, dramatically, it no longer did so?
The kind of alignment between the US and China came out of the 70s, the Nixon opening to China, which was fundamentally about trying to contain Soviet power and sort of shore up the faltering American geopolitical power in the wake of the loss in Vietnam and the pullback in a number of different regions. And because the Soviet-Chinese relationship had collapsed in the 50s and especially the 60s, the Chinese side was really, really open to that. So in the 70s and 80s, you had really a sort of de facto alliance between the US and China on containing Soviet power and pushing back against Soviet initiatives in the Third World. That was no longer relevant after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the kind of devastation of Russia through shock therapy. The new basis for the relationship really grew up because China had begun what I would characterize as neoliberal reforms already in the late 70s. So even as the kind of foreign policy elite is focusing on the Soviet Union in their relationship with China, underneath all of this, there's growing up a new basis for US-China alignment, which is China's attempt to reform its state planning system and its revolutionary political economy in order to integrate into the global market and gain access to foreign technology, gain access to opportunities for exports and much more rapid growth that would allow the Chinese elite to pursue development in a different way, in a way that would reestablish the dynamism of the Chinese economy and the legitimacy of the Chinese elite. So then by the 90s, that formation is coming into maturity, and China is increasingly integrated into the global economy. At least parts of the Chinese manufacturing system, especially those in the South, are producing for export. And at the same time, you see, and there's a significant interruption here with the massacre of democracy protesters in 1989 at Tiananmen Square. But in the years after 1989, the U.S. leaders are trying to reestablish this relationship. There's debate within the U.S. system between those who think we should cut off China and those who think we should engage China and try to encourage liberalizing tendencies within China. Ultimately, the liberalizers win under Clinton, and the Clinton administration negotiates China's entry into the WTO at the very end of the Clinton administration in 2000 and gets Congress to approve it. And that's kind of inaugurates the sort of fully realized U.S.-China alignment, where China is the factory to the world and the United States is the consumer to the world. And all of this is very profitable for American companies that are usually indirectly through subcontracting, exploiting Chinese labor. And increasingly, as China's extraordinary growth really takes off, they're looking at China as a huge potential new market for exports and for producing in China. And there are all these possibilities in the heads of American capitalists for riches if they can just get connected to China. So you get in the aughts, at the same time that 9/11 really focuses foreign policy establishment on the Middle East, in the U.S.-China relationship, you get a period of calm and alignment to the point where the infamous Neil Ferguson coins the term chimerica to describe a kind of melding of the U.S. and China into a single system of growth and global politics.
This produces sort of chimerican great power peace for just about 8 years. How did the 2008 economic crisis begin to break that framework apart?
Yeah, already through this process. So just as we always see with capitalism, the sort of dominant forces seem to be producing harmony, and both sides are gaining from an exchange. At the same time, they're producing tensions and resentments. that build up underneath those exchanges. In the case of China, so this is already in the aughts, when China is growing incredibly rapidly through its integration in the global economy. Yet there is this building resentment on the part of Chinese of being sort of permanently subordinate to American capital. China is doing the low value production. Its workers are making next to nothing. It's not entirely clear what China is getting out of being the sweatshop of the world. On the other hand, on the American side, because the process of neoliberal growth also destroyed the industrial working class in the United States, you have increasing resentment that or allegations that China is stealing American jobs. Because the Chinese government is strong enough to dictate terms to American capital, American capitalists are often sharing their technology and intellectual property with Chinese producers. This is allowing Chinese producers to slowly kind of climb up into higher value production. And by the end of this period, around 2008, you have a lot of allegations that China is unfairly coercing technology transfer and therefore endangering the future of the American economy. And of course, you get the kind of populist economic nationalism that says China has stolen our jobs. China is the reason that all of these jobs got offshored. Particularly after China entered the WTO, there was a new wave. So already in the 70s and 80s, there had been these enormous waves of deindustrialization in the United States that China had nothing to do with. But the most recent wave was in the lead up to the 2008 crisis, and China was at the center of that. And so China sort of gets blamed for this decades-long history of deindustrialization and all of the terrible damage that it does to American society. China kind of becomes the symbol for that. So all of these resentments are building up on both sides, and then the crisis kind of brings that out into the open.
So what does this look like under Obama? What Obama puts in place a China hostile pivot to Asia, but we're still not at the sort of tariffs and trade wars that we'll see under Trump, the full new Cold War posture. Obama, even in the wake of the 2008 crash, he's holding on tight to neoliberalism, even as neoliberalism's domestic legitimacy is in such profound crisis. How would you characterize Obama as a transition point between Chimerica and the new Cold War?
Obama was a true believer in neoliberalism. He was sort of like the triumph of Obama was kind of the triumph of progressive tendencies within neoliberalism. And he himself was a true believer. So his project really was to restore neoliberalism on the idea that we had this sort of this external aberration that caused the economy to freeze up. We just need to put everything back together again and get it going again. It'll be fine. You actually see something similar on the Chinese side, where Chinese leaders had become bought into neoliberal forms of governance and economic rationality and policymaking. And they sort of saw, in ways that often were in tension with how American leaders saw the future of China. Nonetheless, they saw basically China would continue to integrate, continue to open up, continue to reform in ways that were in line with neoliberal rationality. And the 2008 crisis really shook their faith in that system. So immediately out of 2008, you get a reevaluation on the Chinese side, and you get a kind of attempt to put everything back together on the American side. And I would trace that to the different position of the two countries within neoliberalism as a global formation. The United States is at the top. It was the hegemonic power. It was hegemonic at the level of ideology and kind of sensibilities as well. So all of this just seems very second nature to American leaders. And China's leaders, on the other hand, were always kind of struggling to maintain their position in the face of pressure to go much faster towards neoliberal reform, pressures that when they won out in other countries were quite disastrous. So Chinese leaders saw their own kind of success of a gradual neoliberalization. They were quite proud of it, but they were constantly facing criticism from the West that they weren't going fast enough in economic reform, that they weren't politically liberalizing fast enough. And as the United States invaded one country after another in the name of policing the system, Chinese leaders got very nervous about what that might mean for an outlier within the neoliberal system. So on the Chinese side, you had a switch to kind of post-neoliberal ways of thinking. It was gradual, it wasn't all at once, but it started coming out of the crisis. On the American side, that wasn't the case, but nonetheless, American leaders were very disoriented by what had happened. And one of the most indelible images early in the Obama administration was in the midst of the crisis still ongoing, and real questions about whether the global economy would simply collapse. Obama went to China and said, look, can you help us out with this? China was and still is a huge holder of American public debt. And Obama wanted to make sure that China wasn't going to do anything crazy with all the treasury holdings that the Chinese government had.
Like suddenly sell them off.
Yes. Obama was going more or less hand in hand saying, like, look, we recognize that you have leverage over us. Let's make sure that we're going to work together on this instead of being in conflict with it. And he was excoriated in American media for the humiliating performance of sort of subordinating America to the United States. So that kind of captured already. So it's not fully developed yet, but that captured already how China is beginning to move to the center of the anxieties within the American elite about what their entire world seems to be kind of disintegrating.
Was that part of Obama's so-called apology tour?
The apology tour, I think, was about 9/11 rather than China, but it's of a piece. Like Obama was trying to deal with the overreach and the weakness that was revealed by the crisis and by the failure of the war on terror, and sort of the rise of China is the other side of that coin. So this is it's not just about China. It's about a broad failure on the part of the American idea of the end of history that would be the permanent triumph of liberal democracy and free markets and American global power. And that whole thing had fallen apart over the course of 10 years, over the course of the aughts, from the dot-com crash to the failure of the free trade area of the Americas, to the failure in Iraq and then Afghanistan, and then, of course, the financial crisis is the whole thing that kind of crystallizes this broad crisis in the American elite's self-identification. It's not something that emerges immediately, but I think one of the core dynamics of the U.S. turn against China is American leaders simply not understanding why their vision for the future has collapsed, and looking for some kind of explanation that would allow them to return to some kind of agenda for action. And China, because China represents kind of the opposite of those three things, right? China is, the stereotype about China is, it's not liberal democracy, it's state tyranny, it's not free markets, it's state control of the economy. It's not American global dominance. It's the most powerful country that's rejecting American global dominance. So in each of these dimensions, China is the symbol of American failure. And so even though China didn't have a whole lot to do with most of those setbacks in the aughts, nonetheless, it kind of stands as a potentially coordinating symbol for American leaders to get together and try to do something about it.
The economic crisis, of course, was triggered by a financial crisis centered on housing, on mortgage-backed securities. But as the West began to initiate and then double down on austerity programs, it was China that powered the entire global economy's recovery, in part through inflating its own housing bubble. Why was that the move that China made at the time? And how has that inflated housing bubble alongside other changes to China's economy since 2008? Why was that the move that China made at the time? And how did that Chinese housing bubble reshape the Chinese economy more broadly?
This is important because what I said earlier, that the Chinese leaders started thinking in post-neoliberal ways relatively early. But nonetheless, the kind of challenges that they were facing required basically falling back on what you would characterize as neoliberal, sort of late neoliberal financialization as the solution to the crisis. Because the core problem that they face is that the entire Chinese economy by 2008 was based on exporting to the rich countries. And after 2008, the rich countries were stagnant. The U.S. economy failed to recover, and Europe was on the verge of an economic crisis for a number of years. And Japan had been stagnant for many years. So the export markets that China had relied on earlier were no longer growing. And so very quickly, if the Chinese government wanted to maintain growth in the economy, it needed to pivot to some new strategy for growth. The only thing that had immediate effect was building up what was already a real estate bubble into truly massive proportions. And that allowed all of those previous industries that had been focused on export to start producing for the internal Chinese market, whether they're producing steel and concrete for building the buildings, or they're producing furniture and plastics and stuff to furnish the buildings. And this allows growth to take off in a number of Chinese cities that had been really left out of the earlier export-oriented growth as well, because it had primarily been coastal cities that were growing very quickly. Interior cities did not have that level of growth, and many of them had been deteriorating. So by inflating this property bubble, you had the opportunity to seemingly spread growth more broadly. And this takes advantage of the fact that the Chinese financial system remains very closed, and the opportunities for those, and Chinese household savings are very large. The opportunities for household savers to really gain growth of their savings were very limited because state-controlled banks offered very low interest rates. So once the property bubble got going, then people started putting their savings into property because it was the only thing that seemed to have rapid returns. And then it became a self-reinforcing speculative bubble. And so at a number of points, like unlike the American leaders who 10 years earlier had not seen any problem with inflating a property bubble and then eventually faced the consequences in 2008, the Chinese leadership knew all along that this was extremely dangerous, and they were very uneasy about it. It was a source of great anxiety for Chinese leaders. So they kept trying to limit the bubble and bring it down. And every time they tried to do that, the economy threatened to collapse. Growth suddenly slowed. And so they were kind of stuck with this property bubble and tending it and trying to prevent it from becoming too dangerous for about 10 years.
We're going to get, obviously, into the present-day CCP and Xi Jinping later in this interview. But right now, sticking to the 2008 crash and the years immediately following it, how did that crash and the new economic paradigms emerging from it, how did that impact the ideological balance of power within the Chinese Communist Party under Hu Jintao?
Yeah, so Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, his premier, come into office in 2002. And they're facing a landscape that already is reflecting some of these tensions that kind of come bursting forth in the crisis. In particular, there's a lot of unrest around inequality within China, around corruption in government officials, around the kind of the level of insecurity that most people in China had been subjected to as public goods like health and education had been dismantled or privatized. So there's a lot of and there's a huge number of protests, far more protests than in any other country, certainly far more protests than in the United States, kind of complicating the idea that China is repressive when more democratic systems have far fewer protests. The response of the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao leadership was to, on the one hand, to continue with repressive measures against discontent, but really to make a lot of concessions on the other side and to begin pursuing like neoliberalism with a human face by putting in place stronger welfare provisions, by improving insurance programs, pursuing poverty alleviation, moving capital into underdeveloped parts of the country. So there's a whole range of initiatives where Hu and Wen are really trying to reduce discontent by making the system less unequal. But at the same time, there's nothing really galvanizing in that whole process. It's not something that changes the tenor of ideology or the politics. And by the 2008 crisis, and then also because of the stimulus that is the huge stimulus that is the Chinese government's response to the crisis, which dramatically exacerbates corruption and rich people flaunting their wealth, because that stimulus went right into a lot of government officials' pockets, enriched a lot of entrepreneurs who were friends with those government officials, who then drove around in fancy cars. And there's an infamous case from shortly after the crisis of the son of one of these corrupt officials driving a fancy car, running down some school kid and just like screaming as the cops come and get him, screaming like, "Do you know who my father is?"
These are the so-called princelings.
Yes. So the who won leadership was responding to all of the discontent that was there. And another thing to add is just like the shoddy quality of a lot of domestic consumption that ended up poisoning people. Like there was another infamous scandal around infant formula that was debased with an agent that ended up killing a number of babies. So it's like think about that and think about how damaging that is to the legitimacy of a party that claims to be ruling for the people if it can't even keep babies safe, and if corrupt and profiteering entrepreneurs are profiting off of the death of babies. So there was this just enormous buildup of discontent and anger at the leadership. And the evaluation within the party leadership was, this is a crisis of legitimacy that we're facing. And if we don't do something about it, we could lose the ability to control the country. It might run out of control. And one of the things that really focused elite opinion on this question was actually came from within the party. One of the most prominent leaders in the party, Bo Xilai, who's the son of a famous revolutionary, he was the party secretary of Chongqing, which is a city province in Western China that was one of these inland provinces that hadn't benefited that much from growth. He started pursuing a different, a frankly, explicitly populist agenda and populist in the full meaning of the term. He was going after established elites. He was brutalizing criminals, and he was pursuing redistributive policies in the name of the people. And he was doing all of this through a nostalgia for the revolutionary era. So the sort of 50s, 60s nostalgia that you see in populism in the United States and a lot of other places. Same thing in China, but it was nostalgia for the Mao era rather than like Eisenhower America. And he was doing this with the hopes of gaining entry into the top party leadership in the 2012 Party Congress that brought Xi Jinping to power. And because of how this was mobilizing bottom-up enthusiasm, many of the party leadership were deathly afraid of what he was doing, that he's going to organize these people then to assert his own power, or possibly he'll lose control of it and the entire party will be overthrown by these passions. So there was sort of a crisis within elite thinking within the party. And the response to this ultimately was Bo Xilai himself kind of self-destructed in a crazy scandal with his wife involving the murder of a foreign businessman.
A truly, truly crazy scandal if you want to Google it.
And his chief of police ran off to the American consulate in Chongqing, and so there was no way for Bo Xilai to survive that, and that wasn't that wasn't the machinations of these party enemies that brought him down. It was his own mismanagement of his government, but nonetheless, there was the sense that we can't allow another figure like this to emerge. We have to figure out some way to tame these passions. And the conclusion was, and this is in the fallout of the 2008 crisis. The conclusion is, and that was fit in with the larger reevaluation of how the party should run the economy and society and how it's going to fit in the global economy. The conclusion was, we're going to have to bring in some of these populist passions, but do so in a way that domesticates them and try to admit, like basically a top-down kind of populism that the leadership will decide how it happens. It won't be this bottom-up pressure. And so Xi Jinping, I think the best way to understand what Xi Jinping does after he comes to power is a top-down attempt to co-opt, but also to make concessions around some of these populist enthusiasms.
Xi Jinping, who takes over in 2012, he's attempting to sort of routinize and safely kind of institutionalize these populist passions at home. On the global stage, did he immediately anticipate this sort of conflict with the United States, or was that a position that emerging global dynamics, including hostile American actions, ultimately dragged him into?
Well, the U.S. pivot to Asia began under Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State in the first Obama administration. A lot of the tendencies that are identified with a more belligerent Xi Jinping leadership in foreign policy and in domestic policy, they started under the Hu One leadership. It's just that Xi Jinping sort of brought it together as a politically salient package, but the roots go back to the earlier administration. And so you had in 2008 was the Beijing Olympics, which was kind of a upwelling of nationalist passion and the kind of China's entry onto the world stage as a country that could have self-confidence in its success rather than just being another poor country. And there was a lot of tension around the Beijing Olympics because of criticism from the West that China remained a human rights abuser. And that mobilized a lot of Chinese people who were resentful that the West once again is trying to keep China down. So not just within the party or the elite, but popular nationalism that came up in 2008. And then shortly after that, and as part of the response to the failures of the war on terror and the global financial crisis, the first Obama administration begins its pivot to Asia. And the Chinese leadership under Hu and at that time responded, I think, with a level of fear that was not warranted. It was not Obama's intention to prevent China's rise. He was more trying to create an insurance policy. He wanted to work with China at the same time, have bases surrounding China. He wanted like an even-handed sort of like make sure China knows its role, but still wanted to make space for China to grow in ways that were acceptable to American leaders. But I think because of the context this was happening in, when there's a crisis of confidence and a crisis of the sense of the future on the part of the Chinese leadership as well as the American leadership, the pivot to Asia leads to a lot of alarm on the part of Chinese leaders. So already before Xi Jinping comes to power, you have the sense that, America is gunning for us now. And a lot of that is dissipated because the Obama administration doesn't follow through that much. It gets distracted once again with the Middle East, with the rise of ISIS. And so it doesn't at that point, it doesn't fully turn into a conflict, both because Obama has a balanced approach and has a lot of cooperative aspects to his policy toward China, in addition to the more restrictive aspects that begin to build up over the course of the administration. But also just because China is not the main focus for U.S. foreign policy in this period.
Whatever Obama's intentions were and whatever the ultimate failure to actually pivot to Asia was, when you're looking at this pivot to Asia from the Chinese perspective, I imagine those U.S. bases surrounding China loom rather large.
Yes, there are very large American bases on South Korea and Okinawa in Japan. A little farther out, the Philippines remains a treaty ally of the United States, and under Aquino was aligned on sort of anti-China politics. Aquino, Obama had an alignment anti-China politics. Duterte comes in, succeeding Aquino, and kind of scrambles that calculus. But in this earlier period, Philippines was aligned against China. Australia was starting to build up its capacities to counter China. So you have, this is remnants of the Cold War on the one hand, but all of these things were being marshaled with the intention of making sure that China doesn't seize political and military control over the region.
Let's talk about Bidenomics, which is so central to the new Cold War. How did Bidenomics and its much vaunted foreign policy for the middle class, how did it become this multifaceted, overarching economic and foreign policy paradigm and program that combines reindustrializing the United States, facilitating the energy transition, and rebuilding a unionized industrial working class with checking China's geoeconomic and geopolitical rise? What's the policy and political context and history for how this was conceived and then put into action by figures like Biden's extraordinarily powerful national security advisor, Jake Sullivan?
Yeah, I think this is the base, the core story of of the Biden administration is this attempt to respond to what they took to be a crisis of governance and American global leadership and the American economy. And you're right, I think Jake Sullivan is at the core of this, but there are a range of other important personnel around him throughout the administration that are really unusual in previous administrations, whether Democratic or Republican. They have what I would characterize as a bid for hegemony that could succeed neoliberal hegemony. They had, sometimes in explicit terms, referring to neoliberalism, their judgment was that this old system of American power and growth had collapsed, and Trump was kind of the external face of that collapse, but it was deeper structures that had failed. And ultimately, and I think in interesting ways parallel to the crisis of legitimacy and confidence that's happening in the Chinese leadership a little bit earlier, there are very strong parallels with what's going on the American side. They are worried that what they understand, one way of talking about what Xi Jinping is doing is he's trying to shore up regime legitimacy. I think that's a good characterization of what Biden is trying to do. He's trying to shore up regime legitimacy and push back against these populist passions, and he's trying to integrate some of them, those that his people think are workable for the project, and through that integration and co-optation and domestication of these populist passions, then we will renew American power and American growth. This has, I think, three kind of core aspects to it. First is economic nationalism. Second is, and connected importantly to that, is industrial policy. And third is anti-China orientation. All of these work at the level of trying to restore the dynamism of the American economy. They think they take much of the critique that I just mentioned about the Obama administration, that Obama was just trying to put the system back together. He failed. It ended up in stagnation. It caused a loss of legitimacy for the whole system, and then you get Trump, and you get these populist passions because of the levels of inequality and corruption, and that turns into discomfort with all of the changes, cultural changes, and multiculturalism and immigration, and so they're trying to get control of all of these things. They think
it really does. Just to put a pin in that, it really does echo the sort of historical critique made by the left, which is significant for some of the politics around that we'll be getting into shortly.
Yes, no question. And I think an important part of the project here is integrating those parts of left politics that are serviceable to the agenda. But I think it's important to say this is not just a kind of autonomous assertion of left power. It's that the parts that are useful to the Biden goals are taken hold of and the other parts are left off. And that has a decisive impact on what the consequences will be. But so the sort of three facets of this: economic nationalism, industrial policy, and anti-China foreign policy. All these are supposed to work together, and all of them work to revive the legitimacy of like the mainstream political formation that had collapsed during the crisis decade after 2008. And all of them are meant to revive growth in the American economy in a way that will integrate people into the political project as well. So growth and legitimacy feed on each other. And the idea basically here is that the threat that China poses is both to American authority over the world and to the prospects for growth in the American economy, because China is in a position to dominate the so-called industries of the future. And so industrial policy is meant to seize back from China those industries of the future, to reinforce the advantages that the United States does have. And then economic nationalism is meant to co-opt a lot of the Trump politics. So it doesn't reject Trump principles, but accepts them and just lowers the rhetoric. And that works politically, but that also motivates a different orientation towards domestic governance, which is that we're going to pursue these policies in ways that help people. It's not just you get higher growth or you get higher profits in the corporate sector or higher stock market valuations, then you have economic success. It's that you have to create decent jobs and you have to get people bought into this whole system. Otherwise, it's not an economic success. But then all of that then also relies really heavily on the anti-China foreign policy agenda, because it's both motivated by economic nationalism and by the needs of industrial policy. But also those two other parts of the agenda don't succeed if China continues to gain stature and power at the rate that it has. So these things are all connected to each other, and they really are in the Gramscian tradition of hegemony. They're an attempt to establish a new hegemony that would succeed the old end of history hegemony that most of these people come out of, right? Like these are people who come out of the financial sector, who come out of long time staffers in very mainstream neoliberal democratic congressional offices and neoliberal democratic presidential administrations. Like there are very few figures here that come out of the left. So these people, Jake Sullivan most of all, really represent a sea change on the part of thinking in at least part of the economic or the political elite.
How has today's economic conflict between the U.S. and China taken the shape that it has? And then what exactly is that shape? What sort of technological breakthroughs is China attempting to secure, and how does that fit into China's overall economic development plan, the so-called attempt to move up the value chain? And then how is the U.S. attempting to block China from accomplishing it all? Where do resources like critical minerals, products like semiconductors, and in various forms of technology protected by intellectual property, where do these all fit into the struggle that's underway?
Right. I think it's helpful to see that the motivation here is at once economic and military, and these are thought to be strategic industries because they're important for American military power, but also because they sustain the ability of American companies to dominate what are expected to be the high value fields of the future. And that kind of blurring of those boundaries there had been very sharp distinction between those two realms in neoliberal thinking. The collapse of the distinction between the economic realm and the security realm, which we've seen in the United States and we've also seen in China and around the world. This, I think, is symptomatic of the collapse at a deeper level of the way that society was working previously, that sustained I think kind of a weird idea that you could separate these different realms. But the fact that leaders in China and the United States and many other places are now thinking about all of these things as intrinsically connected, I think is very significant. And it's that kind of gets at the core of why the U.S.-China conflict is potentially so explosive, because it's not just about who controls some reefs in the South China Sea or something. It gets to the basis of the ability of leaders on either side to succeed in their core goals, which is to maintain economic growth and regime legitimacy, and the connection between those two things. Fundamentally, I trace this tension to the emergence of a zero-sum landscape in both global economic terrain and the terrain of global political power and authority and status. These things, going back to that earlier conversation, one of the things that permitted the US and China to be aligned was the sense that it wasn't zero-sum, that when I pursue my project of growth and legitimacy, I do it through the growth and legitimacy on the other side, and vice versa. What has happened in the post-2008 climate is that global growth dropped. The dynamism in global capitalism itself is lower now, and there's less room for both countries. At the same time, China is moving into sectors, higher value sectors that American companies had previously dominated, and is posing competitive challenge to American companies. At the same time, you have a kind of stagnant consumer demand not in China, but in most other parts of the global economy, that poses very serious problems for American companies and for any exporters anywhere. So all of these kinds of zero-sum pressures are convincing leaders on both sides that they will have to restrict the other side or find ways to kneecap them if they want to succeed in their own project, and that's the kind of and that combined with the securitization of economic thinking that previously had been separated from military considerations. Those dynamics together make for the prospects of what might once have been sort of normal economic frictions it opens up the possibility that these economic frictions could become points of military conflict.
It's a key irony you identify that neoliberalism sort of requires a non-zero sum sensibility for its legitimacy, but is at the same time ultimately laying the groundwork for zero-sum worldviews everywhere. And this groundwork is being laid with the deindustrialization and inequality and all of the problems that are happening during the heyday of neoliberalism. And then the bill really comes due. And then with the 2008 crash, suddenly there's a massive, what seems like a massive ideological shift, but that's really been germinating on the ground for decades.
And I think it's worth recognizing that why the crisis did that. So again, there's the underlying pressures are there, that these inequalities are increasing, but as long as growth continued, the broader ideology of self-responsibility, reward for sort of what one is able to succeed in the market, that ideology was sustainable because you could find some other path. You could always, there was a lot of mobility and flexibility within the workforce that seemed to open up opportunities, even if they most of the time were dead ends. And then ultimately you have the recourse to the sense that if you fail, it's your own fault. So the neoliberalism itself created a whole host of zero-sum conflicts, but it was hard for people within the system to recognize them as zero-sum conflicts. And it's when it's the crisis, which no longer allows that ideology to function, that reveals the structures that neoliberalism itself had built up. And then alongside that, you have the ideology, the sort of complementary ideology within neoliberalism of intense, brutal competition as the mode of human relationships. On the other side of that, when the idea of mutual gain is no longer tenable, that sense of brutal competition not only persists, but is amplified by the crisis conditions. Because now that it's clear to everyone that there's only zero-sum possibilities, the only way that you can survive is if you brutalize your opponents. So on the one hand, I would characterize great power conflict as a post-neoliberal way of thinking and a way of organizing countries, but it draws on these developments within neoliberalism, even as it goes beyond them. And ultimately, it's neoliberalism prepared its own crisis. So we should not, I want to be very clear that populism is a response. It comes out of neoliberalism. It's produced by neoliberalism. It's not just the opposite or this external, return of the past, these atavistic remnants that had somehow persisted and now they've come back and it's so terrible. No, all of these possibilities were created by neoliberalism itself. And then when it could no longer sustain itself, then they came out into the open and are now moving beyond it.
I want to parse how much of this is particular to the Biden administration in terms of the new Cold War being the Democratic Party policy norm. A question that seems particularly important given that Kamala Harris is now the Democratic nominee. There's been a lot of speculative analysis over what Harris's foreign policy team, namely her national security advisor, Philip Gordon, what it means for what a President Harris's foreign policy might look like. I've seen this especially in terms of what it might mean for the U.S. relationship with Israel amid the unfolding genocide in Gaza. Generally, Gordon has been described as more of an Obama administration type figure, more dovish and pragmatic, at least, and this is all relative, at least compared to Biden's intensely hawkish team led by the likes of Jake Sullivan and Brett McCurk. What do you think Harris and Gordon and others might mean for the U.S. relationship with China?
Yeah, I think that's a accurate characterization. And I think if you look at some of the Deputy National Security Advisor, her Deputy National Security Advisor, Rebecca Lissner, and an earlier advisor of hers who has co-authored with Lissner a book, Myra Rapp Hooper. They co-authored a book about what U.S. foreign policy should look like after Trump that was published in 2020. And so you can get a sense of their sensibilities, a very clear sense of their sensibilities circa 2020. Now, they've been in the administration for a number of years, and it's possible that they've changed their thinking. But that's more helpful on China because Gordon has very limited, his focus has been Europe and the Middle East. And we don't have a lot of information from him on his thinking on China. But I think that all the indications kind of point to Harris's people are a lot of the economic officials who are advising Harris right now, like Brian Deese, Mike Pyle, who was her kind of international economics advisor for a long time. Some of these prominent advisors in the campaign, at least, they really come out of the Jake Sullivan school of international economic great power conflict. So I think I don't want to foreclose the possibility that Harris could go in a different direction than Biden, because I think the Biden-China policy points towards a very serious conflict at some point in the future. And I think that some of the people around Harris will be a little bit more open to thinking about different possibilities than the Biden administration has proven. But at the same time, if you look at the Listener and Rap Hooper book, it claims to be trying to chart out a more pared down American foreign policy that does not focus on military primacy. They argue instead for a commitment to an open world, which is to say basically allowing the free movement of goods and ideas. But their vision of how that happens is essentially that the United States creates the framework for that. So it is not a multilateral vision drawing in other powers and coming up with shared institutions.
Which it's really just a liberal way to restate the case for American primacy.
Right. So I think they're critical of some of the outcomes of primacy, but the assumptions behind their conceptualization, I'm not sure are significantly different than the assumptions that led to the period of primacy, that led to the outcomes that they're critical of. It's more that some of the rhetoric of the end of history era, that the United States would bring democracy everywhere, they're taking seriously that rhetoric in a way that I'm not sure is warranted given the actual practice of American foreign policy. And they're saying, and so we went too far on that. We should pare back our goals. We should not try to impose democracy everywhere. We should not try to change other countries' systems internally. But of course, the reason that the United States tried to change other countries' systems internally, it was perfectly happy to keep despotic systems that fit into American geopolitical priorities. It was really only those that were adversarial to American geopolitics that were targeted for regime change or for these kinds of critiques of democratization or whatever. So I don't want to foreclose hope that Harris could go in a different direction. And I don't think that U.S.-China conflict is locked in stone yet. But I think it would really take more than what's internal to what would become the Harris administration to move it in that direction. And that's always true. Like that's a call to those of us who want a different future, that we need to be active on this. We can't just let it go.
I've heard the argument that Biden's domestic and foreign policy program here is essentially a reheated Cold War liberalism. It looks for some ameliorative social reform and modest social investment at home, insofar as that domestic economic program is sutured to a geopolitical project of consolidating American power. But the problem here, I think, is that the wages of military Keynesianism, something Tim Barker has pointed out, they're declining. You simply can't squeeze the social spending or job creation out of contemporary military spending in the way that you could during the first Cold War with the Soviets. How new is this new Cold War? Is it in some ways more an extension under perhaps radically new conditions, an extension of the last Cold War?
There are some similar dynamics, but I would be very hesitant to use that, to push that analogy too far. I think it will mislead us. Maybe most importantly, the U.S.-Soviet Union Cold War came after a period of growing labor power that was in the U.S. system was expressed through the New Deal and through the labor mobilizations that followed the New Deal, and ultimately institutionalized through World War II. We haven't experienced a similar triumph of organized labor, but the standing of organized labor in this system is not there. And for the system to work as a political economy, you need labor to be stronger. It needs to be able to squeeze gains out of growth to sustain consumer demand that then allows for the further expansion of the economy. And you had sort of the Soviet corollary to that through the planned economy and through the state organized forms of unions. In both the US and the Soviet Union, regular people had a standing and a status, an economic standing and a political status that they do not have now. And that was fundamental to the way that system worked. The Cold War then came on top of that and stabilized that formation. So even as it introduced horrifying levels of violence into peripheral areas, it stabilized the core system in the United States and the Soviet Union by imposing a compulsory patriotism and helping to regiment people around production. And the Cold War system begins to dissolve when that compulsory patriotism and that sort of popular support for the Cold War starts to dissolve in the middle 60s. So we do not have that kind of buy-in to a political project in either China or the United States. China is maybe closer to achieving that kind of popular integration into the elite political vision. But even in China, there continues to be significant discontent. And there continues to be very strong kind of liberal currents, even in elite sectors, that are critical of the direction Xi Jinping has taken. So you don't have the coherence of the system on the Chinese side. And the American side, it's, of course, massively less so. There is no authority on the American side. It's the politics is so deeply split. So even though there is a lot of commonality in regarding China as an enemy on both sides, in both the Trump camp and the Harris camp, the ability to pull off something like the Cold War formation requires coherence at the level of politics as well. And I think on both the US and the Chinese side, that fundamentally has to do with the fact that neoliberal levels of inequality and neoliberal dysfunctions in the way that investment and productivity are working have not been solved on either side. So that's all to say that we don't have a stable basis for a bipolar great power conflict. And as awful as the Cold War was, and we should recall that it laid waste to the lives of millions upon millions of people. As awful as it was, it also created a stable basis for great power relations. And so it excluded the possibility of that's too strong, because we came very close to blowing up the world. But we at least had a foundation.
In retrospect, it ultimately succeeded in excluding the possibility of an actual armed conflict between the Soviets and the U.S.
Yes, we did come very close, but when we came close, it was through accidents. It wasn't intentional. I don't think we have that level of stability either internally or in the U.S.-China relationship right now, and you can see that on something as banal as like crisis management. The U.S.-China crisis management discussions have been almost impossible. So if we did have a minor conflict over some little island in the South China Sea, there wouldn't really be a way of preventing it from spinning out of control, except that like leaders act sensibly, and you can't count on that, of course. That's very different from the way that the U.S.-Soviet Union relationship was institutionalized in all these different ways. And I think that also builds on the kind of stability of the Cold War system, builds on just the sensibilities of post-war Fordist capitalism, which is all about large-scale planning and stable bureaucratic organization of social forces on both sides. So I think we're just the landscape at a deep level and at a superficial level is totally different from the Cold War.
I'm Astra Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denvir, a podcast that helps us understand the past so we can organize for a better future. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by The Syllabus, a nonprofit knowledge discovery service founded by friend of the pod, Yevgeny Morozov. The Syllabus is doing artisanal automation. How does that work? Well, they use technology to monitor thousands of sources, and each week, human creators, that is, actual people, handpick the best of what's been published on the internet. When you sign up, you'll begin crafting your custom feed, picking from 6 languages and 60 topics, like far-right populism or energy and extractivism, heterodox economics, or AI and automation. Everything is there. Each Monday, you'll get a new batch of personalized recommendations of essays and books, academic articles and reports, videos, and even, yes, podcasts. I highly recommend that Dig listeners check out The Syllabus. Visit their website at the-syllabus.com. That's the-syllabus.com. They offer 2-week free trials, and if you enter DIG at checkout, you'll get 30% off your first year. Polls have shown a real jump in anti-China sentiment among the American people, and critically, this is really just not a long-standing anti-China sentiment, not a long-standing sense that opposing China is a top political priority for most Americans. It really seems to reflect a new common sense that's solidified and grown in recent years. Is what we've been seeing here, is it basically just a story of political elites essentially manufacturing popular support for anti-China hostility?
I at one level, I think more or less, yes. If you look at polling of opinion on China, it has never been great, but you didn't have massive levels of hostility expressed in the polls until 2018. Some polling reflects, like Pew tracks this stuff over the years, and there's a jump up around 2012, 2013, which actually precedes Xi Jinping entering office. So it wasn't a response to Xi Jinping. And Americans don't really know that much about what's going on in China anyway. So I think it's unlikely that it's a response to domestic developments in China. Certainly, Xi Jinping's agenda didn't really roll out. Like, we couldn't see the outlines of it. And actually, many outside commentators expected him to be a more liberal figure. At first, it's not really until a number of years in that it was clear he was going in a different direction. So I think that the real leap comes in 2018 when Trump started the trade war. On the one hand, I would say, so yes, Americans and people in most countries generally follow their leaders if their leaders tell them that this country is threatening them. You see strong agreement with that. If the leaders change their opinion on that, you see the dissipation of that opinion. People don't follow foreign affairs that closely, most people. But on the other hand, I think that there is also a deeper well of opposition to foreigners that is also playing a role here. It's not that people were, I think in one of the outcomes of the collapse of neoliberalism, discrediting many of the things that progressives are very pleased has been discredited. I think another thing that got discredited with the crisis of neoliberalism was cosmopolitanism and international connectedness. And I think we should recognize that there are progressive aspects of neoliberalism as well. And they're expressed in one-sided ways that often undermine the promise or ultimately make it impossible to realize the progressive promise. But nonetheless, there are these progressive potentials within neoliberalism that I think we're in danger of losing. And one of those things is the idea that we could have a global system that united everyone in the world and guaranteed the interests of everyone in the world and allowed us to coordinate on the terrifying threats that face everyone in the world, of course, particularly climate change. I think we're losing that. And so I think the kind of xenophobic sentiment was out there to be mobilized. It didn't have to be directed at China. But I think people were primed to see foreign countries as sort of stealing this or that from us or posing threats to us. And one response to that, and we see this on the left as well, unfortunately, one response to that has been sort of a turn inward and a focus on America, the line that we should not be engaging in overseas conflicts. We should take care of the problems in America. We shouldn't be engaging in overseas conflicts. We shouldn't be starting conflicts in the way that the U.S. foreign policy has in recent decades. But sort of implicit in that is also we should just get out of the business of thinking about foreigners in general and just focus on Americans. You can get some progressive outcomes from that, but ultimately I think if that's the direction you're going to go in, you lose a lot of the possibilities for reforming the global system that ultimately is going to come back and undermine the progressive project.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember here that anti-Chinese and more generally anti-Asian sentiment was for a very long time absolutely central to American xenophobia. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the reference to aliens inadmissible for citizenship, meaning Asians. This was the xenophobia that organized American nativism.
Yes, and you see a lot of strong continuity, too, with the sense that China is an economic threat. China is stealing our jobs. So it's the status of Asians and Asian Americans in the United States has changed somewhat compared to 100 years ago because it tends to be professionals now who are present in the United States, and that brings with it a different set of stereotypes and racist images. But you still see that same kind of like the threat of coolie labor that was at the core of anti-China racism 100 years ago. You see it today too in the idea that Chinese economic development is unfair. It shouldn't be allowed. It can only happen at the expense of our workers. And of course, implicit in that is native-born Americans, usually white in this image. So you do see, I think, important continuities that are very dangerous. But I also want to say that, like, I always want to push back against the idea that, whatever ancient sin is present today is because it's part of the essence of our country or something. I don't think that's the case. I think that the reason those kinds of racist images flourish today is because of conditions today. And I think it's possible to move in a different direction because you see the polling reflects hostility towards China, but if you dig down into it a little bit, it's not quite as monolithic as it seems at first sight. And you ask a little bit more precise questions, like if you phrase them in, you sort of force people into making a choice between should we be making our military stronger to prepare for war with China, or should we be pursuing efforts to reduce the likelihood of war with China? You get overwhelming majorities for reducing the likelihood of war with China. So yes, there is a lot of hostility out there. I think a lot of it does come out of anti-foreign feeling that has really increased over the last 15 years. But I think there are also a lot of misgivings on the part of the American people. They do not want to be dragged into great power conflict. And I think our political leaders are misreading that just because of the climate in DC. Everyone in DC is acting like China is our enemy. So they're like, yeah, that seems right. And people don't really like China, so I better go with this or else I'm going to be destroyed politically. I think that's wrong. And when you look at a little bit more careful polling, you get a more complex picture.
Let's get more into how the left, broadly construed, fits into the new Cold War. As we discussed, the China boom, it played its role in devastating American manufacturing jobs. And then Bidenomics proposed as the solution to this a renewed industrial policy hitched to the new Cold War with China. And so for many on the left, or maybe to be a bit more specific, I'd say a certain swath of the left liberal policy world, For many in these circles, building a more pro-worker capitalism after neoliberalism, a sort of New Deal, has become inextricably bound up with the conflict with China. What sort of progressive constituencies have converged in various ways behind this new Cold War, and what should we make of that?
There's one side of it that's kind of human rights liberals who have always maintained that we need to apply greater pressure towards China, and they play kind of a rhetorical role where the enthusiasts for conflict will marshal their talking points and use them more or less cynically to demonize China. The thing that you're pointing to, I think, is more significant both politically and economically, and that's constituents like organized labor and like certain policy entrepreneurs around who are trying to break the hold of free market dogma, strengthen the power of labor, increase the power of the state to intervene in the economy, to shape the market, and potentially to pursue some planning functions. That kind of formation, which there are different parts of it, but they all kind of are symbiotic in coming together around anti-China politics to move their agenda, even if they don't really believe in it. I think that has been at the heart of the Biden project, both in terms of policy development and in terms of political constituencies, in particular because the blue-collar working class dominates the Rust Belt, and the idea that the Democrats will have to win back Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania if they hope to hold the presidency. That really gave priority to the sense that we have to bring workers along. Workers hate China, so we have to have anti-China politics for political reasons. And someone like Ron Klain, who was Biden's first chief of staff and very powerful in the administration, he really articulated that approach. On the other side, you have people developing industrial policy in pursuit of making sure that American companies dominate the most important sectors of the future, and making sure that U.S. military has access to manufactured goods, that so it's not just relying on Chinese production in the event of a crisis. That whole formation, which is really strong around Jake Sullivan, that has been really important. And a lot of their thinking is either driven on principle or opportunistically with the hope of a post-neoliberal message that we need to make the world better we need to make America better for workers. And in order to do that, we have to develop these practices of economic statecraft that will have to be anti-China also.
What does organized labor's position on the new Cold War look like? Does it vary by union? Is it in flux in any sorts of ways? And then do you see some way that the labor movement might reorient its position in such a way that it would see a cooperative relationship with China as in the interest of the American working class?
I think the first thing to say is that organized labor's orientation on China comes out of the actual experience of neoliberalism, which actually did pit Chinese workers against American workers. And it was because they were in a zero-sum contest between these different workers that they have drawn the conclusion that we must be in a zero-sum contest with these workers. So that represents, I think, on the one hand, a very realistic evaluation of where we've been. And if we are headed for great power conflict, then probably a realistic assessment of where we're going. On the other hand, I think it represents a really profound failure to imagine a different approach to working class power and what the working class could be at a global level, that not only doesn't require great power conflict, but requires that there not be great power conflict to pursue. So I think that is to say there is a potential different path for organized labor if it can be organized in that direction. But the current landscape of labor, particularly the blue-collar unions, the steel workers are especially polemical in their statements on China. A lot of these unions just are at the forefront of demonizing China and saying that we absolutely have to exclude Chinese production from America. We need to try to cut China out of global markets. Otherwise, there's no future for American workers. I don't think, however, that that's monolithic. There are progressives and internationalists in labor. They're not maybe the dominant current, but they do exercise important influence. And I've been in discussion with some of these people. They understand why this is so dangerous for the future of labor in the United States, why it betrays the working class, if you think about the working class as a global formation. So those voices are there. The question is whether there's the political space for them to try to reorient labor in that direction. And so I think that sort of opens it out again. Like part of the solution here is changing, sort of doing organizing within labor. But part of the solution is also this larger discussion within the United States about China policy.
You write, quote, while the bipartisan technology and trade agenda is heavy on rhetoric about American workers, the substance of the policy is focused on the profitability of domestic manufacturers, their access to critical raw materials, and defending the U.S. stranglehold on advanced technologies. Is one major problem that the left and labor need to confront here exposing this nationalist mystification whereby the interests of American capitalists are dressed up as the interests of American workers? Your line there reminds me of Ho Fung Hung's argument that Chimerica was possible while it was possible because it was to the seeming universal benefit of corporate America, but then became intolerable once Chinese companies became competitive. Has this ever really been about American workers at all?
I mean, yes, but sort of in a derivative way, I think I would say. There's no question that the Biden people is thinking about restoring the legitimacy of the regime runs through renewing the appeal to the working class, particularly imagined as blue collar, generally male workers. And so that is an important motivation and one of the things that kind of pulls the whole thing together and gives it some political impetus that it wouldn't otherwise have if it were just a question of the foreign policy establishment. So I think that is a part of it, but yes, if we look at the actual industrial policies that the United States is pursuing, so far the largest rollout of industrial policy has been around getting semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. And there are virtually no jobs to be had in semiconductor manufacturing. So it's their highly automated precision plants. This is not going to do anything for the American working class. Even if you could get decent wages and representation in these factories, there's just not that many jobs to speak of. It'll be more significant, I think, with some of the stuff coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly the measures that will possibly allow the American auto manufacturing ecosystem to survive. Chinese car companies are now so competitive that it probably does require some level of protectionism for American car companies to make the transition, because they've put it off for the last 20 years, so they're in a bad position now. They will probably require some protection, and that is auto manufacturing is an enormous source of jobs, as well as kind of innovation and dynamism in the American economy. So in the space of a few years, Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers are so competitive that all the legacy factories, all the legacy automakers in the US and Europe and South Korea and Japan, all of them are afraid of what's going to happen to them. The US is a little bit unusual in under Biden this year now cutting off any Chinese competition at all. There's 100% tariffs on Chinese imports. Just yesterday, they came out with a regulation that will ban software, Chinese designed software in internet-connected cars, which is all of them now. So essentially, the United States is saying, no, we will tolerate no Chinese cars in our country. Other countries are allowing them, but trying to limit the degree of competition. And that's that kind of gets to, I think, an important complication in the field of organized labor, because like UAW has a real interest in making sure that American car makers survive. And if U.S. protectionism makes American car makers so uncompetitive because they're not exposed to the cutting edge of technology and production techniques, that's a real problem for UAW. So, like UAW has potentially a different path than the steelworkers do in thinking about the future of Chinese economic relations. It's not that workers are not part of the consideration here, but it's also, I think, quite clear in the way that the Biden administration is making policy that the important question is whether American companies will be able to dominate the industries that the Biden administration considers strategic, that it thinks will be the future of growth, and that it thinks will be the future of American military and political power globally. And so the selling this politically, it always runs through the working class and creating good middle class jobs and all of this stuff. That is not the primary motivation. And I think that means that the interests of workers could very well be sacrificed at some point down the road if they become inconvenient to the larger project.
You argue that bringing back industrial policy is not necessarily a good in and of itself. Instead, it matters what the industrial policy aims to manufacture. And you write that the left and labor, quote, exploiting geopolitical tension in this way is a Faustian bargain. It risks institutionalizing a post-neoliberal form of economic statecraft specifically devoted to great power conflict rather than human well-being. The focus of industrial policy, then, would be on products useful in international conflict, as today's fixation on advanced technology and military production already reveals. Core human needs of housing, health, and education would be marginalized, dismissed as distractions from the urgent priorities of national security. If we continue on the current trajectory towards conflict, the pressure to sacrifice the interests of workers in the name of strengthening our corporations would swamp any short-term gains. Lay out this critique of industrial policy. How materially does industrial policy being geared toward this sort of great power competition, how does it concretely distort the whole economic system, stretching from research and development to what sorts of goods and sectors are prioritized?
Yeah, research and development, actually, I mean, it's, going back to the progressive aspects of neoliberal society, one of them was the idea that science and technology is something that will benefit all of humanity. So if one company in one country makes a breakthrough, that's something that can help everyone in the world. And of course, again, like neoliberalism systematically frustrated that potential through intellectual property and through by making it only possible for some countries to engage in research and development. But nonetheless, that principle was there, that idea that science and technology are for human beings per se, not for particular human beings. One of the most kind of alarming developments, I think, at the level of thinking over the last 10 years is that we have moved seamlessly, almost without discussion, from that idea that science and technology can benefit all of humanity to the idea that science and technology should only benefit us. Our country needs to hoard the benefits of research and development. And the corollary to that then is that anyone who is not us must be excluded from our research and development system. And that led to the advent of the Justice Department's China initiative under Trump, which was kind of notoriously a witch hunt focused on university researchers that mostly ended up catching people who did their paperwork wrong or who had not reported their associations with some Chinese research body properly. Most of these cases fell through, even though they did manage to ruin a number of people's careers in the process and drive a number of very talented researchers out of the United States and back to China. So that's kind of at the level of principle and at the level of what this is doing to our culture and our sensibilities. I think that's a huge red flag, very, very troubling development. You start getting to the question of what this is doing to economic policy priorities and to where investment is going. The kinds of sectors that the Biden administration is prioritizing and that Congress has gone along with have been those that are thought to be future high-value sectors, and those that will be useful if we ever have military conflict with China. That means that the entire rest of human beings' lives is neglected. And it's actually far more important for human beings that they have basic things, housing, healthcare, education, If we're looking at the poor countries, things like sewage, things like electricity lines, the availability of clean energy globally, these things are not being prioritized. Clean energy is part of the Biden package, but it's in there because they think it's going to be strategically so important to the future of energy production. It's not in there because we want to make sure that human beings can continue to live on this planet. And you can see that reflected in the fact that, we're trying to, like during the pandemic, the Biden administration did basically nothing to get the COVID vaccine to any countries other than the United States. So that does terrible damage to American economic interests as well as the human lives that were lost because of that decision. All of these enormous potential export markets were terribly damaged by the devastating inequality of the pandemic response. And that was the Biden administration. That was the Trump administration did it too, of course, but that was continued by the Biden administration. So the basic critique here is that because we're so fixated on great power competition, we put our energies and our talents and our resources into a set of things that are important for that competition, but are not important for changing the basis of the global system for people, giving people in this country and every other country a decent life. And I think that actually is creating the forces pushing the two countries against each other at the same time. Because the zero-sum structure of the global economy is there because we don't have enough people making enough money to buy the things in the global economy. Chinese and American businesses could both succeed at the same time if we had more consumers in developing countries and in poor parts of the United States. Those people are not prioritized because they just are not significant within the blinkered vision of great power competition.
Let's get into the military dimension a bit more. What's the current political and military dynamic and balance of power in the Pacific? We see constant movement around diplomatic allegiance and military alliance across the region, pitting the U.S. against China, but also involving India, Japan, multiple other countries, conflicts circling around Taiwan, the Maldives, the Philippines, elsewhere. What is the emerging balance of power in the Pacific, and what are the major points of conflict as a rising China runs up against a giant, deeply rooted U.S. military presence dating back to World War II? And how is that then, over the last decade plus, how is it spiraled into this self-reinforcing dynamic of aggression and reaction?
The Chinese military position has become stronger and stronger at a very rapid rate, not because China has devoted very much of its total economy towards the military. It has been quite low. It has been consistently lower than share of GDP of the United States, and it has been fairly steady. So around 2% of GDP has gone to military spending consistently now for some 20 or 30 years. But because the Chinese economy has grown so rapidly, that means in absolute levels, the amount of resources going into the Chinese military has leapt up. And that means that China's military capacity, particularly in the Western Pacific, is now so powerful that there are real questions whether the United States would win a military conflict with China in the region. So that is, this is another thread of the kind of anxieties that has driven the foreign policy establishment and American political leaders towards containment orientation towards China, is just the sense that almost out of nowhere, there was this country that we never thought was a threat, and now all of a sudden, it's the only country that could really beat us in a war. The American response has been starting under Obama, but really ramping up under Trump, and particularly under Biden, because Biden's priority has been to reinforce alliances and to coordinate alliances in the region as well as outside. The Biden administration has tried to bring NATO into this to a certain extent, but the real focus has been trying to shore up alliances with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and signal to China that if you do anything to change the status quo in the region. By far, the most important question here is Taiwan. But a secondary and persistent question is who's going to control the South China Sea? The United States is basically trying to signal to China, don't do anything, or else we're going to have this rock solid response coming from most of the powerful countries in the region. China has read that as threatening, as constraining, for obvious reasons. But China is also kind of moving into certain great power habits. And we've seen this recently with the way that China has been engaging with the Philippines. I was in Beijing and talking with researchers in July, and I heard from them just exactly the kinds of condescending great power attitudes that you hear from American foreign policy establishment types all the time. Like, the Philippines doesn't know what's good for it. What happened? The Philippines was working with us and then they changed. It must not be because there's any serious interest on the part of Filipino leaders in this. It must just be because the United States is pulling the strings. So you're seeing these patterns on both sides where increasingly they interpret all developments everywhere in the world through the conflict. And if something goes wrong, it's because the other side has nefariously done something. It's true on the Chinese side, it's true on the American side. And that's just another way in which the conflict itself distorts perceptions and deforms the ability to respond in ways that I think would be smart to a lot of the developments in the region. And then in this background, then anything one side does that they think is trying to signal to the other side, don't be aggressive. The other side takes that to be a form of aggression and then ramps up their assertiveness in order to deter the other side, and the other side thinks that's aggression. So you have a kind of escalatory spiral that's moving us into an arms race in the region that could become very dangerous.
Speaking of that danger, we're recording right as Israel's war with Lebanon has roared into increasingly lethal strikes in Beirut. And it occurs to me that Israel's gambit of multiplying fronts in order to shore up the basic foundation for its genocide in Gaza. This has demonstrated that there's no single way to start a war. Hot wars, sometimes they escalate slowly, like a frog simmering in water. And one only realizes that full-on armed state-to-state conflict is underway once that water's already boiling and it's too late. How close are we to being in a situation where an actual hot war with China could actually start? Are we there already? And then what might an actual war look like?
I think we're still quite a ways away from any kind of military conflict with China, outside of the possibility of some kind of accidental, because the two militaries are now operating so close to each other. The United States flies something like 1,000 surveillance flights just off the Chinese coast per year, which averages out to more than one a day. And China has become increasingly intolerant of this kind of surveillance activity on the part of the United States. So Chinese planes have been flying dangerously close to American planes, and we have a precedent for this back in the very early days of the George W. Bush administration. There was a collision between aircraft that led to the crash of the two planes involved and the death of a Chinese Air Force pilot. So these kinds of things can happen, and that was in 2001. That was kind of the height of stability in the U.S.-China relationship, and it still assumed crisis proportions. It was only worked out after a significant amount of time negotiating between the two sides, because the Chinese side was holding the American pilots who had crashed. For something similar to happen today, who knows? But that said, so there is a real danger of some kind of accident spinning out of control, and I wouldn't dismiss that. But that said, the Xi Jinping leadership and the Biden leadership, I commented on some of their kind of parallels earlier. I think in foreign policy, they also have strong parallels. They're both fairly cautious. They're not looking for a conflict. They really don't want a conflict, in fact, even as the way that they're acting builds pressure towards a conflict. So I think under Biden and under Xi Jinping, they would be very reluctant to let some kind of conflict spin out of control. But again, there's sort of this background political pressure on both sides to not look weak, to be responsive to nationalist currents in their societies, to keep their foreign policy establishments on board. In the event of any conflict, that would give the advantage to those who want to push it further. And again, these dynamics could spin out of control. In the short term, though, I think, and particularly before the election, both sides really are holding things down. The Chinese leadership wants to focus on the Chinese economy, which has not been going well. The Biden administration wants to prevent any sort of conflict that would give the advantage to Trump in the election. So I think this year, hopefully, will be okay in the U.S.-China relationship. But at the same time, these pressures are building up. They're not doing anything to resolve the pressures. The zero-sum structure of the global system is there, and they're not acting to fix it. Neither side is acting to fix it. So in the short term, I'm not too worried. In the long term, I'm very worried.
Speaking of the November election and people who don't like looking weak, we discussed what a Harris presidency might mean for U.S.-China relations. What could a second Trump presidency look like?
Right. I mean, so this is the other consideration, right? We don't have the Biden-Harris types in charge. We have kind of chaos agents who are interested in upending things. A Trump administration is much harder to predict because it would really depend on who the personnel are in charge of China policy and in charge of this larger set of questions around economic policy and industrial policy. And we don't know who those people would be. We can be fairly sure, though, that they're not quite the same as Trump. Trump has a very solid orientation towards economic nationalism and a fixation on the trade balance. And there are very few people in the Republican Party at the level of policymaking professionals who have that particular orientation. You have some people who are kind of the remnant neoliberal free trade orientation, financial interests. You have some people who are like neoconservative in their orientation and think that we have to confront China because it stands for tyranny and only American power can bring democracy everywhere. You have some people who are realist in orientation but are aggressive offensive realists who think that it's unacceptable to allow China to gain power in the region. We must act now to prevent China from gaining any more power. And so both the neoconservatives and the offensive realists would lead towards conflict. And then you have the kind of nativist and reactionary currents that are embodied by J.D. Vance, most of all, who see China as a civilizational or a cultural or a racial threat and find the presence of Chinese influence in American society unacceptable. They're interesting because they say they don't want international conflict. They want to focus on problems at home. And by problems at home, they mean, Mexicans and Chinese. So there's an interesting kind of like the xenophobic motivation means that they're even as they say we want to get out of these stupid wars, they're very amenable to being drawn into some kind of international conflict that could be brought about by neoconservative elements or offensive realist elements. And then you have the economic nationalists. And someone like Lighthizer, we would expect someone like Bob Lighthizer to be prominent in the administration. And Trump has threatened to impose 100% tariffs on all Chinese imports to the United States. We can expect that a Trump administration would really take the anti-China economic warfare that the Biden administration has pursued and build on that. So another source of tension really would be, I would expect the kind of economic nationalist and economic restrictions of the Biden administration to be built out and exacerbated under Trump. So it's hard to, and like Trump himself, if he seems, like Trump is the person who ended the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and pursued maximum pressure, just horrifying levels of economic violence against Iran. He's the person who assassinated Soleimani and almost started a war with Iran. He's also the person who, on the edge of that war, said, no, we're not going to have a war. He's also the person that when Iranian proxies attacked Saudi oil fields and the sort of core issue in Saudi security, he said, no, we're not going to defend that. Let them take care of themselves. So Trump himself, when it comes to some of these military issues, he could go any which way. It's really hard to know. So I would expect Trump people to sort of move us in deeper into conflict with China in ways that could lead to it spinning out of control much sooner than we would see it under a Harris presidency. But at the same time, Trump is sort of a wild card in all these things.
Let's turn to your proposals for alternative paths forward. The silver lining of there being all of these contradictions and contingencies in the status quo is that it's really incumbent on us to exploit those and try to push forward a model for a much more humane way forward. Anyhow, you argue that the previous neoliberal consensus is what gave the U.S.-China economic competition its zero-sum quality. Quote, neoliberal globalization consistently failed to create the broad growth that would allow prosperity in all countries. This is a result of two key imbalances in the global economy: inequality between workers and business, and inequality between the developing countries and the developed countries. On the growing inequality between labor and capital, we know that story really well in the U.S. We're living in a new Gilded Age where vast swaths of former manufacturing communities have been devastated amid the rise of a new hourglass-shaped service sector. In China, inequality soared there too, but at the same time, millions have been lifted out of poverty at a historically unprecedented scale and speed. So first, to start this off, just what is the relationship between domestic economic inequality in China and in the U.S.?
The point I want to emphasize here is, because so often in American discussions of this, it's kind of like the rich people in America succeeded and everyone else was left behind by globalization. And in contrast, China got most of the gains from globalization. That's a common line you hear in American thinking about this. And I think it's more complicated than that and more parallel than the conventional story tells us. Because the advent of neoliberalism in China and the United States were connected to each other, and they traveled a parallel path of destroying the power of organized labor, which was based in the Northeast in both countries, and creating in its place, drawing in a different group of workers for newly expanding jobs, in particular, vulnerable workers who were migrants. In the US case, it was undocumented immigrants. In the Chinese case, it was this hundreds of millions of people from rural areas who migrated to the cities for new jobs, who were similarly undocumented. They were not technically allowed to be in the cities because that was not their place of registration, and that made them vulnerable to exploitation in a parallel fashion. And then in both the United States and China, you have the emergence of a kind of very wealthy elite, a well-off professional class, a devastated industrial class, and then a huge pool of low-wage workers at the bottom. So in the Chinese case, many of those workers were industrial, and that was not true on the U.S. side. But the sort of broader parallel wasn't just industrial workers in China; it was also people working in restaurants, people selling stuff on the street, people taking care of hotels or something. Like there was this enormous pool of low-wage labor. So the kind of class structure is very similar, even if some of the sectors of production are different. So I think the difference with China, the reason that China is the only country to see major wage gains and to see major declines in poverty in the world, is two things. One thing is, as I talked about earlier, the Chinese people were active in making these demands, and they were threatening the ruling class in China in a way that other countries didn't face threats from their people. And that led to, and because of the particular sort of authoritarianism within China, is often responsive to popular demands, even if it's also repressive towards the leadership of those demands. You had an outcome where there was a real dynamic within the leadership to increase wages in order to buy off the discontent. But that was only possible because there was extraordinary productivity growth in the Chinese economy. And that gets to the other core feature here, which is development. That in China, in contrast to all other developing countries in the neoliberal era, China achieved development because the state forced foreign direct investment to act in ways that elevated Chinese businesses within the global production hierarchy, in the global profit hierarchy. So because the Chinese economy was more developed and because productivity was rising so fast, it was possible for Chinese capitalists to make wage concessions to Chinese workers in a way that was impossible for other countries that were much more stagnant in terms of productivity, or that were much more focused on in the informal economy in terms of the jobs that were being created.
How does this inequality then within countries relate to the second problem you identify of inequality between countries? The U.S., as we all know very well, it sits atop an extremely hierarchical, unequal capitalist world system that's for centuries transferred vast quantities of wealth from the global south to the north. And China's own history really, in many ways, exemplifies aspects of that broader pattern. China, in the early 19th century, represented roughly a third of the global economy, the size of its economy, but was then decimated and de-developed by colonialism, with its share of the global economy falling to as low as 5%. Today's China boom, then, it's returning China's economy to its traditional size and its place within the world in a way. But it's not done so much to develop other global south countries. There are exceptions here, of course, like the commodity boom unleashed by China's voracious demand for raw materials. But in large part, it's been a developmentalist model created by China that works for China. Why should the U.S. and China care about the profound poverty of so much of the post-colonial world?
I guess I would be reluctant to say that the model was created by China and for China. China took advantage of the structure of opportunity within the neoliberal global economy, which said to poor countries, you can gain access to capital and you can create jobs if you maintain cheap labor and allow us to invest and exploit that labor. And then it was done through these subcontracting chains that allowed companies in the rich countries to often become divorced from production entirely and sort of focus on cultivating their brand or working on design like Apple does, or focusing on the financialization that ultimately coordinated all of this decentralization of global production. So the difference with China between other countries that also integrated into that system is that the Chinese state was big enough and was organized enough to take advantage of that to pursue development. Other countries did not have the size of the market to leverage the demands of the state, or the state simply wasn't constituted in such a way that it could take advantage of opportunities for development. So China pushed development as a national project and succeeded in a way that no other country did. What that ultimately meant is that China, because it was so successful at constituting a thriving environment for investment and for the exploitation of labor, it drew a lot of opportunities that other countries were also competing for, but were ultimately uncompetitive in. And that meant that even the ability to integrate into low-wage export production was lost by many countries because China took all of the space in the global economy for that. And remember, the space in the global economy for low-wage export is limited by the demand of the rich countries. And the rich countries are massively richer than other places, but there are still limits to the amount of demand, consumer demand, that they exert within the global economy. And after the 2008 crisis, even that was stagnant. So the neoliberal global economy imposes these constraints, and China sort of like took advantage of the possibilities and moved them in ways that were not anticipated by the architects of the system. But ultimately, it wasn't sort of a decision to exclude it. Just that was the outcome for other countries.
So again, why should the U.S. and China care? Why not? Great, our country is hoarding wealth and resources. Fantastic, we're nationalists.
Two things. Ultimately, because both countries have kind of a great power agenda. In order to realize that agenda, they have to act globally, and they have to exert their leadership globally in order to shape the circumstances within the global system that will favor their core commitment to growth and legitimacy in their own systems. And on the part of China, you can see attempts at doing this from going back a couple decades now, when China was going out, when Chinese companies were going out into into other countries to cultivate reliable supplies of raw materials that could be pulled into the manufacturing systems in China, they were willing to make concessions to the demands of those local governments in order to build up the diplomatic goodwill and to gain steady access to those raw materials that would have been very unusual coming from Western companies, Western resource companies, or the companies of other countries, Brazil or India, or that became involved in some of these lines as well. And more recently now, after the trade war, when Chinese companies have been looking for places to organize production outside of China so that they could export into the American market, there's been a huge wave of direct investment in manufacturing coming from Chinese companies in countries that are well positioned to gain access to those markets that they're afraid of losing in the rich countries, places like Vietnam or Mexico or Singapore is sort of the financial destination for a lot of Chinese companies to avoid the association with mainland China. So just as a matter of course, they're pursuing some of these things. The United States, in response to a lot of this stuff, is getting more involved in development in order to counter the threat that China gains influence in these areas. It hasn't amounted to a whole lot thus far, but it is a notable different orientation on the part of American foreign policy and sort of development thinking, that they would start to act in ways that like supporting development projects that only China would have supported in the past, things like railroad projects or clean energy projects. That's the reason that they actually are interested in this. But from a progressive perspective, which is not one that the leadership in either country shares right now, I think the motivation would be, we want to create enough space so that we don't have to engage in horrifying military conflict, so that we can accommodate both sides. And that is helpful to us because we value stability, and we value stability in the interests of our ruling class, not, as a humanitarian motivation or because we care about the people of the world or something. Both the US and China are status quo powers that gain a lot from the way the global system works right now. But the global system itself is becoming increasingly dysfunctional and is increasingly pushing the two most powerful countries in the world into conflict. So that poses immense dangers, not just to human life and well-being, but also to the ruling class in both countries. And if they were more far-sighted, and if they had a better analysis of the source of these tensions, I think they would be able to see that reforming the global system in a way that could accommodate both countries would be in their interest, their narrow interests even.
What sort of new global economic and security architecture could China and the U.S. help create that would address these inequalities both between and within countries, and also thus bring about a sort of great power peace that's both more just and more durable? And then what could a world order organized around U.S.-China cooperation actually look like? We desperately need to confront the climate crisis. We must prepare for and then respond to future pandemics. We have violent conflicts and problems all over the world, from the Middle East to Ukraine and Russia, problems that I imagine U.S.-China hostility is making worse rather than better. So to close out, what might U.S.-China cooperation look like? And then what sort of world might such cooperation make possible?
Yeah, I would pose that question as a challenge to progressives to think about what our bid for hegemony would be. So the Biden bid for hegemony we talked about earlier, it's quite clear to me that it has failed. Trump would not be a danger to the country in the way that he is if it had succeeded, because a bid for hegemony that succeeds revolutionizes the political foundations and excludes previous contenders for power. So the Biden bid for hegemony failed, which is unfortunate because we still have reactionaries running around with a real chance of gaining power. But it's also fortunate in the sense that it hasn't institutionalized great power conflict as the future of the entire world. So there is an opening for progressives to articulate a real alternative here. The alternative, I think, is rather than being motivated by a desire to reinforce American power, the power of the American state and American corporations over the world, and the assumption that that means that American power automatically brings freedom and democracy, it starts from a critical orientation towards American society. It starts from the demand that we democratize American society, and also the recognition that the project of democratizing American society will be unsuccessful unless it's part of a larger global project for bringing the possibility of genuine democracy beyond just the rich countries. And by genuine democracy, I mean something that empowers people so that they can exercise real self-rule, not just that they have a vote, but they exist within a context that systematically disempowers them from governing themselves. The kind of system that is that would provide basic public goods to everyone in the world. Things like, we were talking earlier, things like sewage systems and electricity, clean energy, public health systems, education, housing. I think that progressives can articulate an alternative to the Biden vision and to the Trump vision by calling for a commitment on the part of both the United States and China and the other rich countries to join together with all of the developing countries to guarantee these basic access to these basic needs. And that would not only create, I think, a foundation for democratic struggles to be renewed within all these different countries, it would also create the economic potential for a different form of growth that is broader based, more inclusive, that drives productivity higher, that opens up the global market in ways that U.S. and American corporations could both succeed. In some sense, it's very similar to the New Deal logic of growth. By empowering workers, by raising wages, by guaranteeing collective forms of consumption, you have source of legitimacy in the political project, and then you also have the economic basis for an inclusive kind of growth. But the important difference with the New Deal system is that this would be global in scale, and that means it would at least have the possibility of not repeating the horrors of Jim Crow and the Cold War that went along with the sort of post-war version of New Deal America.
Well, Jake Werner, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dan. Glad to be here.
Jake Werner is acting director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute and a co-founder of Justice is Global. He writes on the connection between great power conflict and global capitalism. I'll include a link to his most recent report, A Program for Progressive China Policy, in the show notes. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, it is the special task to make the English workers realize that for them, the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theo Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. You can also find at thedigradio.com links to a special Thawara feed. That feed includes our entire series on the history of 20th century Arab East politics. If you haven't caught up yet, don't worry. It is all on a new, specialized feed. Look it up at the Dig website. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at The Dig Radio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, also leave us a nice review and rating. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you telling people you know to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us. And please do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.